Right, these next two lessons are going to be the last two lessons in Unit 2, which means we have about 8 more lessons of American West left before we finish the course. Now, what we're going to look at for this set of lessons is conflict with the Plains Indians. So we're going to look at the battles that the Plains Indians had with white settlers and the US Army. Now, some of these battles were horrendous. And these aren't the only battles we're going to look at. In Unit 3, we're going to look at some very significant battles. But around 1862 to 1876, this is where the conflict, the unhappiness, the anger started to boil over. So this is the Edexcel specification, the scheme that the exam board give us, as I've looked at in previous lessons. And you can look at the very bottom bullet point of key topic 2, subtopic 3. We look at conflict with the Plains Indians, Little Crow's War, and the Sand Creek Massacre, which will be this lesson. Then for the next lesson, we're going to look at the significance of Red Cloud's War, and then look at the impact of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Then we finished Unit 2, which means we're starting to build this picture of how the Native Americans' lives had been sort of removed by the end of this course in 1895. So just a few things to remember before we start this lesson. We need to know these because this is a key reason as to why conflict occurred. So in 1851, don't forget, we had the Fort Laramie Treaty. And what the Fort Laramie Treaty did was it agreed to fixed boundaries, which effectively began to put tribes into reservations that they couldn't leave. Now, reservations were also became a driving force, a driving policy by the government after the 1851 Indian Appropriation Act. So it must be made aware that the Native Americans were beginning to be put into these reservations that made their way of life very difficult to follow. Now, as we go on a bit further, we've got to understand that during the period 1861 to 1865, the American Civil War was happening between the North and the South, as we mentioned in the previous lessons. So the American Army was very busy with this. So there came a time where it was very difficult to fight back against the Native Americans because the US Army were very preoccupied with sort of fighting each other. But what does need to be understood is that 10 years into Fort Laramie Treaty and Indian Appropriation Act, is that reservations were starting to have a serious impact on Native Americans' way of life. You've got to remember that everything else is going on in the backdrop, okay? We had to have development of the cattle industry. America had started to grow significantly in the years 1861 to 1865. And remember, the people that got the better treatment were the settlers. The people that were migrating to America were always seen as more useful and potentially favoured upon over the Native Americans. So, what are we going to look at over the next few lessons? So, the Indian Wars you should know about. We're going to look at Little Crow's War, 1862. Then we're going to look at the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. And then next lesson, we're going to look at Red Cloud's War between 1866 and 1868. Now, what needs to be clearly understood is that all of these conflicts were caused by poor Indian treatment. It can be argued that it started in 1851 when the Fort Laramie Treaty was signed, as I've just mentioned, that the Fort Laramie Treaty promised that Indians would have certain areas for their tribes and settlers, more importantly, would not be allowed into. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the first two wars, Little Crow's War and the Sand Creek Massacre. We're going to look at the build-up, the causes. We're going to look at the narrative, what actually happened, and then we're going to look at the consequences, the aftermath of the wars. Before we do that, it must be understood that each of these wars had a leader. Little Crow's War, obviously, Little Crow. Sand Creek Massacre was led by an Indian chief called Black Kettle, and Red Cloud's War, hopefully we get it, was run by Red Cloud. Now remember, although chiefs didn't have ultimate power, there would be occasions where chiefs would lead a war effort against the white settlers, the US Army, if it meant that their tribe was going to get better treatment. So there's a lot of information here. You have got some tasks to do after this, but I'm going to just explain Little Crow's War. And there may be some concepts that are difficult, so I will explain it in as much detail as possible. But the key thing is that you know, number one, what happened, number two, what happened because of the events, and then just importantly is to go through and know the order, just in case you've got a narrative account question on the wars, which happened in the first year of the American West Paper. So, even though Little Crow's War started in 1862, many people argue that the anger of the events started in 1851. So in 1851 in Dakota, the Sioux gave up 24 million acres of land. Now the Sioux are a Native American tribe. In return for the 24 million acres of land, they were told by the government they would receive $1.4 million as a lump sum, and they would get a yearly payment, an annuity of $80,000. And because of this, they moved on to 2 reservations. They knew that actually the government supporting them and the government giving them this money would help with the future of their tribe. Even though Native Americans may not have had the need, or they would have given up their way of life, they knew that if they didn't start adjusting, that they could easily die out. The reason that the Sioux gave up their land is the second bullet point here, is because the number of white Americans who were beginning to settle on their land was growing, and the number of animals to hunt were decreasing. So the Sioux knew that because there were so many white settlers moving onto their land, they weren't going to have as many animals to hunt. They weren't going to have the buffalo to hunt. So by agreeing to go into a reservation, they knew that the government would look after them, hopefully, and they would get their food through the government. However, the government failed to stick to the deal. Now, it was claimed that the Sioux were in debt to traders and they owed $200,000. So because the Sioux were in debt to people, the government refused to pay their $1.4 million until they paid the money. Now, obviously, the Sioux refused, so the government refused to pay. This began the struggle of the Sioux Indians. Now, white settlers then started to settle on the reservation land that the Sioux were given, which made it even harder for them to survive. They were already struggling because the Sioux were a huge nation of Native Americans, and they were put onto this small reservation. And because white settlers were starting to settle on it, it made it harder for them to survive. They were already struggling as the reservation was too small to support the number of Indians on it anyway. So effectively, the Sioux's land were becoming smaller. Now, in America, you also had agencies that sold food to the Native Americans. And the agency that was meant to sell food to the Sioux Indians held on to it for many weeks until it got to the point where they were starving. It then sold the food for much higher prices because they knew that they were desperate. And another thing that made the Sioux Indians very angry is that the quality of the food they were provided was in some cases inedible. So the food they were receiving was poor, they were being charged ridiculous prices for it, but that was because the agency were holding on to the food. Now don't forget, if you were a Sioux Indian, this is going to cause an extreme amount of anger, and it eventually is going to all blow up. And this is where we get to the year 1862. So this is the cause, this is the bubbling under the surface. Then it snaps. So by 1862, the Sioux Indians were desperate. Their crops failed because obviously the Native Americans weren't the strongest farmers. The US government hadn't given them money they had promised, and they were starving. Some of the Sioux Indians had to resort to eating grass to survive. And the other annoying aspect is that the agency who had the food, they had lots of food, but they wouldn't give it to them. But there was lots of food stored away in warehouses, not being given to the Sioux Indians. They're the causes. So this is you know, a real life or death situation for the Sioux Indians. But what actually happened? The events. In 1862, Little Crow and other chiefs decided to go to war as the US government was fighting the South in the American Civil War. So Little Crow and other chiefs thought it'd be a perfect time to go to war with the US government because many of the soldiers were busy fighting the South in the American Civil War. So what did they do? So Little Crow and the Sioux Indians, they attacked settlers' towns, took food from the government and gave it to the starving Indians. But the thing here is Little Crow said that there really shouldn't be much death. Little Crow wanted this to be a peaceful war where they got what they wanted. They got food and they went back and they lived. However, the warrior brotherhoods, disagreed with this, and it became a lot more violent than Little Crow actually wanted. And as a result of this, the warriors went on and killed women and children as well as male settlers. So it became more of a revenge mission for the warriors, the warrior brotherhoods, and it totally went against what Little Crow wanted. All Little Crow wanted was to attack the warehouses and get food. The warriors didn't agree. This is where the US government got involved. They sent more soldiers. And it led to 400 of the Lakota Sioux being captured, with 38 of them being executed. They're the events. Now the consequences, because of this, the Lakota Sioux were sent to even smaller reservations with much worse conditions. So because of this event, it actually, if anything, made the living conditions for the Sioux a lot worse. Because they responded, because they attacked, because the US government had to send more soldiers in, they were treated in a negative manner. So the rest of the Sioux, the Lakota Sioux who survived, they were sent to much smaller reservations with much worse conditions, which led to many dying of disease. And then later on, Little Crow was shot by a hunter who scalped him. And then another man cut off Little Crow's head as a trophy. So what needs to be understood here? Was this a success or a failure for the Native Americans? Quite clearly, a failure. The consequences were that reservations became worse for them. Now, the reason why the government probably decided to do this was to deter, to stop any future attacks against the government. I mean, you can probably argue, if you're sitting listening to this story, that the attack was justified. Little Crow and his chief, the fact that they went and attacked for food, that was justified because they were resorted to eating grass. You could also argue that actually the whole structure of the Native American tribe caused this to occur because the warriors didn't listen to their leader, which led to US government putting people on trial, 38 Native Americans being executed, and then as a result, reservations becoming worse. Once they're put in these smaller reservations, their lives are not going to get any better. So that's the events of Little Crow's War. Now you've got a few tasks to do for this. So the first task, let's get rid of this. There's two tasks. So task one, what do the following words or numbers have to do with Little Crow's War of 1862? So there are a range of numbers here. You need just to write down the number or the word and write down what that is to do with Little Crow's War. Then task two, complete a profile on Little Crow's War. Who's involved? Why did it happen? What events occurred? And what were the consequences? So if you write those four titles down, leave about 5 lines in between and bullet point. Who was involved? Why did it actually happen? What events happened that led to the war? What actually happened in 1862 and what happened because of Little Crow's War? So you can pause the video now. These are your two tasks for this war, and then spend about 20 to 25 minutes on this. If you have to listen back to the events of Little Crow's War again, please do. Pause the video now and then carry on onto the next war. Right, the next war. There really isn't, this one's quite a small event to look at. There's definitely not as much content. But what needs to be understood is there were different tribes involved in this war. Okay, remember there were lots of different tribes in Native American structure. So in the last war, we looked at the Lakota Sioux. In this one, we're going to look at the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. So this one's called the Sand Creek Massacre, and there's actually some quite shocking things to hear in this. So I'll go through this one again and then set you 2 tasks so you can get on with this. Causes. Gold. Now, a lot of these wars were caused by the fact that gold was found in their land. Now, remember, the Fort Laramie Treaty said that white settlers were not allowed to come into Native Americans' land. But the moment gold was found, that agreement tended to be ignored. So in 1858, gold was discovered in Colorado, and gold miners, the prospectors, went there in huge numbers. They crossed land that belonged to the Cheyenne and Arapaho. They hunted their animals and settled on their land. And as I said, this broke the Fort Laramie Treaty, but the US Army did nothing to stop the settlers. That's a problem. It breaks that agreement that the government and the Native Americans set out in 1851. So if you were to get a question saying, explain 2 consequences of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, you could actually discuss that war was a consequence because of the consistent breaking of the Fort Laramie Treaty. So the events. The Arapaho and the Cheyenne chiefs agreed to move into a reservation in East Colorado, and this was known as the Treaty of Fort Wise. Now, they did this because they realised if they stayed where they were, that they would come into conflict with the number of gold miners that were coming into their land. However, many warriors refused to go. Remember, you didn't need to listen to the chiefs. They fought the prospectors and were known as the dog soldiers. Remember, chiefs couldn't order people to do as they said, they could only ask. Now, after 3 years of attacks, Black Kettle tried to bring peace. So there were 3 years of attacks between the prospectors and these dog soldiers, okay, between the years 1861 and 1864. But after 3 years, Black Kettle decided that there was time to bring peace, it was time to stop, it was time to bring harmony back to these tribes. So what happened was that Black Kettle camped out at Sand Creek near a US Army fort. Now what he believed is that if he camped there, he was under US government protection and he'd be safe. And on the 29th of November, 1864, Colonel Shivington attacked the camp with 700 soldiers. So Black Kettle and the Native Americans were attacked, okay? But what needs to be understood, and this is the shocking part of the Sand Creek Massacre, Black Kettle immediately surrendered. He actually waved a white flag. But Colonel Shivington and the US Army still killed over 130 men, women, and children. And it said that he was ordered to do this by the governor of the state who wanted the Indians dead. So this was a massacre. It was a massacre that happened when they were trying to make peace. Black Kettle and the Cheyenne and the Arapaho were trying to bring an end to these attacks. However, Colonel Shivington and his men killed 130 men, women, and children, even though a white flag was being waved, which is symbolic of surrender and peace. Scalps and body parts of the Indians that were being killed were displayed in local saloons, in pubs. So there was no remorse of the people that had killed them. If anything, it was seen as a celebration. Black Kettle escaped. He told the other tribes about the massacre, and many Indians concluded the US government could not be trusted. I'm going to add something here. You could argue that this event caused a bigger rift between government and Indians, which made the relationship very difficult. And this event was known as the Sand Creek Massacre. Why? Well, it happened in Sand Creek, and because it was a massacre of people that were effectively innocent. So what happened because of the Sand Creek Massacre? So you've got the causes, you've got the events, now the results, the consequences. So the government set up a peace commission to try and stop fighting between the Native Americans and the US government. And the government was under pressure. So the government was under pressure because of the Civil War. So bear in mind, this happened in 1864. In 1865, the government agreed to a treaty which gave the Cheyenne and Arapaho a larger reservation, and they agreed to compensation to all the victims that were massacred at Sand Creek. But by 1867, they backed out of their agreement. Why do we think the government backed out of the agreement? The Civil War had ended by 1867. So the government could focus more on dealing with the Indian problem. After they backed out, that's when the government became stricter. The government forced the Cheyenne and the Arapaho into a smaller reservation, half of what they were promised in 1865. So in 1865, they were promised a cracking piece of land. They were promised compensation for the loved ones that had been lost. They were allowed to, the one thing they were told, they were allowed to hunt buffalo in this small reservation. But once the buffalo were gone, they were gone. Why is that going to be problematic? Well, that's their main source of food, which means they become more reliant on the government in the long run. This was a long-term game for the government. It was all about making the Native Americans abide by their rules. Under this agreement as well, under this enforced agreement in by 1867, they also had to agree to stay away from white people's property. No compensation was paid to the victims of Sand Creek Massacre. And by 1868, Black Kettle had died in another massacre of Indians by US troops. So this was another way of the government, I'm just going to add this here, the government enforcing their control over the Native Americans. It was a way of them making sure that fighting and hostility went down in the long run. And the key thing the government keep doing is by making reservations smaller, which means the Indians become more reliant on the government get control. So it's just an ongoing cycle for the US government. Right, your tasks for this. Task 1, write down the questions and answer them using the information that we've just been through. And so the questions: when was gold discovered in Colorado? Why did gold in Colorado cause problems between the settlers and the Arapaho and the Cheyenne? What was the Treaty of Fort Wise? Why would the Arapaho and Cheyenne not been happy with this? Who were the dog soldiers and why did they cause conflict? What did Black Kettle try to do after 3 years? Why did he feel safe to do this? What happened in 1864 to suggest it was a massacre? Give 3 facts. Why was the government under pressure to stop fighting in 1865? What did the government agree to in 1865 for the Cheyenne and the Arapaho? What happened to the government's agreement in 1867? Give 2 reasons why this could have caused anger. And then what happened to Black Kettle for number 10? Answer those questions, write the question down and then answer them so you don't need to do them in full sentences. And then task 2, complete a profile on the Sand Creek Massacre. Who was involved? Why did it happen? What events occurred in, just ignore that 1862. What events occurred in 1864? So we'll get rid of this. It was 1864, the Sand Creek Massacre. And then consequences. What happened because of the Sand Creek Massacre? So again, spend 20 to 25 minutes doing this. And once you've done that, that's the end of this first lesson. So what needs to be understood is that today we've looked at the first 2 key wars. We've looked at Little Crow's War and the Sand Creek Massacre. The reason we look at Red Cloud's War in so much detail is because it has a significant consequence that we must look at as part of the Edexcel specification. But as long as you know why things happened, what happened, and the consequences in order, then you know these wars significantly. If the exam board are going to give you any narrative account question that works, it probably would be the wars. In the first year, we did, I think it was 1862 to 1864, so it actually covered Little Crow's War and the Sand Creek Massacre. And then last year's exam, there was actually a question on a consequence that happened because of Red Cloud's war. So the more you develop your understanding of these wars, the better, which will allow you to really understand the consequences in the long run.